Hi, how's it going? It's Michael Redmond here. Now, you may well know me as a stand-up comedian, which I actually was for over 30 years, or you might know me better as Father Stone from the Channel 4 sitcom Father Ted. And if that happens to be the case, and you're still wondering how I am after all these years, well, I'm still fine. So, what am I doing here? Well, I've kind of retired from stand-up, but I keep coming up with, the odd idea for a joke or a comedy monologue or a comedy routine and that kind of thing, because to be honest with you, I quickly realised that taking up gardening in retirement wasn't going to satisfy me enough. It wasn't going to do it for me. Jesus, gardening. And anyway, I don't have a garden, which is probably why I was often found standing in other people's gardens over the years. So what's this all about? Well, this is my comedy podcast, which I've called "What Are You Doing in My Garden?" I suppose the best way to describe it is it's a short weekly podcast in which I'll be, throwing in a joke or two or talking about a range of things from, say, drink driving in Ireland in the 1970s, my chance encounter with Joanna Lumley, pole vaulting geriatrics, and lots of other things. But no poetry. Absolutely no bloody poetry. So if you have anything to say or add to what I've been musing on the podcast, it'd be great to hear from you. Or in fact, also if you have any questions about Father Ted, I'd be happy to answer them as well. The email address for the podcast is whatdoyoudoinmygarden@gmail.com. Hello, welcome back to episode 10 of What Do You Do in My Garden? Episode 10, a bit of a milestone, I think. And we're here on a rather gloomy Glasgow. For once, it's not to do with the weather, even though the weather is actually still shite. The air of gloom is about Scotland's thrashing from Germany on, Friday? 5-1. Bit of a fucking humiliation. So there's been a bit of an air of gloom around Glasgow, and I'll be talking about that in more detail later, because I do consider myself a bona fide Scotland fan, because I've been here for 25 years and my 3 sons are Scottish, so I think I can slightly call myself Scottish. Well, 95% bona fide fan of Scotland. I'll be chatting about that a bit later in more detail, more depressing detail. I'll also be giving you an update on the little competition we have about how many times the commentator Ali McCoist will say, "I'll go a CE," throughout the whole commentary of the Euros. And I'll be updating you because I've got quite a few entries. I think about 25 people have guessed what number it is, and I'll be updating you that later. But first, before I do all that, I want to talk about fig rolls. Yes, fig rolls, you heard right. Now, I'll tell you why, because about 3 days ago, my son Jamie was over in my flat, and I asked him did you want a cup of tea? So Dad made a cup of tea, and I brought a plate of fig roll biscuits back in. And when I put them on the table, he just kind of looked at me and started laughing. He said, "Fig rolls, they're just old man's biscuits. I'm not having a fucking fig roll. They're horrible." And I thought, are fig rolls old man's biscuits? I'm sure I had fig rolls in Ireland when I was a kid. So I asked him, what exactly is a young man's biscuit or a young person's biscuit? He said, "Oh, it'd have to have chocolate on it, for fuck's sake." Yeah, okay. I'm not against chocolate biscuits, but it's not just a young man's biscuit. They should try. They're not being experimental enough. Try a few biscuits without chocolate on them, and see what you come back with. But is there young man's biscuits, old man's biscuits? Is there middle-aged person's biscuits? Should supermarkets divide their shelves up into young man's biscuits, middle-aged man's biscuits, and old man's biscuits? I don't know. But as far as I'm concerned, he's wrong. Fig rolls are bloody good biscuit, and they don't have to be covered in chocolate. But to me, the sort of god of all biscuits, or the king, if you want to be more regal about it, is a biscuit called chocolate Kimberley. Now, many of you will be completely unaware of chocolate Kimberleys, unless you're from Ireland, that is. Because when I lived in Ireland up till I was about 35, I used to love chocolate Kimberleys. I'd have about a packet a week. But when I came to London, no sign of chocolate Kimberleys anywhere. Then when I moved up to Scotland 10 years later, still no sign of chocolate Kimberleys. So I kind of just forgot all about them. Now, I'll just explain what chocolate Kimberleys are, if I can. It's kind of a sandwich of marshmallow. They're sandwiched in between sort of 2 circles of soft, kind of gingery. It's more like a cake texture than a biscuit texture. And this marshmallow is sandwiched in between these 2 pieces of ginger. It's not as strong as ginger nuts, but it is slightly gingery. And it's covered in milk chocolate. And they are a fucking delight. But I'll tell you the story was about 3 weeks ago. I was walking along the canal near where I live, and it leads to a big Morrison's store. I hadn't intended going to the Morrison's store, but when I got there, I realised I needed a few groceries, so I wandered into Morrison's. I think it was on the second aisle. I saw this little sort of shelf saying Irish products, And there was chocolate Kimberley. I couldn't fucking believe it. I finally found my chocolate Kimberley after all these years. It was almost a eureka moment. I think I didn't actually run down the aisle with delight, but I was like a kid in a sweet shop. I couldn't fucking believe it. So if you'd ever get the chance, whether you're young, old, or middle-aged, go and get some chocolate Kimberleys. But I'm a happy man. I can get chocolate Kimberleys now anytime I want them. It's a new lease of life for me. Now, before I go any further, you know, the title of this show of this podcast is called "What Are You Doing in My Garden?" Some of you may be aware why it's called that. Some of you may not, and I'll be tell you in more detail near the end of the show what it is all about. And so on to the football. And I did mention earlier that I was a bona fide supporter of Scotland, and my producer tells me I got the word wrong. It's bona fide. So if any of you are going to ring up screaming that I got the word wrong, I know now it's bona fide. So Scotland did get a bit of a thrashing the other night, which is a bit of a shame. And, you know, I think realistically, most people realise they weren't going to beat Germany on their home ground, you know, in the opening match. I think there was a chance in a million. The other possibility was, I suppose, a faint possibility of a draw, but I don't think anybody really thought that was going to happen. I think most people thought they were going to be beaten by Germany, but they didn't think they were going to be fucking trounced. That is the problem, because I think we all thought, well, you know, get beaten by Germany and then beat Switzerland and Hungary and we're through from the group. But after that display, you know, I don't know whether they have much hope against Switzerland, because Switzerland looked pretty good against Hungary the other day. But you never know, they might just turn up on the day. We, you know, don't give up hope until we actually see. But it's not looking very promising, I'm afraid. And also a little update on the competition I had with about how many times Ali McCoist is going to say "I got to see" throughout the whole tournament. Now I watched the Scotland-Germany match, and he only said it 4 times. I couldn't believe it, because he normally says it about each match he commentates. He normally says it about 20 times, but he only said it about 4 times. And I have one entry from some guy. What's his name? Jim Smith is his name. I think it's at Moser on Twitter, and he guessed 480. So I think, Jim, you can throw the towel in. You're not going to win. But in case anybody gets the wrong impression, I'm not actually taking the piss out of Ali McCoist, because I think he's a brilliant commentator, or co-commentator, or whatever you want to call him. But I think he's the best in the business. I really love listening to him. So this isn't to take the piss out of Ali McCoist at all. And one other thing I'm very, very pleased about, and I think most people are, is that TNT or BT Sport, as they used to be known, are not showing the Euros, because otherwise you'd have to listen to fucking Steve McMenamin. Well, I say Steve McMenamin commentating, but he doesn't actually commentate. All he does is echo or repeat whatever the commentator is saying, like things like, yeah, very much so, Fletch. Couldn't agree more, Fletch. Very much so, Fletch. Couldn't agree more, Fletch. Very much so, Fletch. Couldn't agree more, Fletch. Couldn't agree more, Fletch. Very much so, Fletch. So a bit of a rap song in there somewhere. Okay, we're back now. I mentioned, I think on a couple of episodes, that I did stand up for over about 35 years before I retired. And one thing that always sort of not so much confused me, annoyed me almost about, was that why is it stand-ups are the only performers that are heckled? No other performers are heckled. Not that heckling is always negative. Sometimes it can work very well. I mean, if you get a positive heckle and you're on stage, it can really make the show, because you can go off on a riff or off on a tangent according to whatever the heckler said. It could be a supportive heckle, and even if it is, say it is a negative heckle. If you're doing really well, if you're going down really well, and the audience are loving you, and some idiot heckles you, it doesn't really matter, because the audience are already on your side. So you can just tell the audience to tell them to shut the fuck up. The only time it works for a heckler is if you're already, maybe dying in your arse, and then you get a heckle, and it's probably the end, because if you are dying in your arse and you get a heckle, that probably everybody else in the audience is quite pleased that you got heckled, so it's time to go. But some comedians like heckles, some don't. But there's one a notorious comedian called Malcolm Hardy. He's passed on now, but he ran this infamous club called the Tunnel Club down in South London. And he used to actually encourage heckling. He loved heckling. It was his big thing. And I think he actually used to book acts that he knew would die on their arse and be heckled. But some of the heckles were very funny. And there was one story that he booked a mime artist for the Tunnel Club. And he knew, a mime artist in a stand-up club isn't going to work. But Malcolm knew that. But the mime artist was on stage for about 5 minutes to total silence. And then one of the audience just shouted out, "I'm blind, tell us a joke." And that was the end of the mime artist act. But Malcolm loved heckling, that was his thing. And I know he was also booked to do he was booked to do 20 minutes, half an hour in some club in Manchester. And he went up to Manchester on the train, and he came off stage after 10 minutes, and the promoter of the gig said, "I booked you for half an hour," and he says, "I thought to be more heckling." So it suits some people, it doesn't suit others, But it is just stand-ups that are heckled. I mean, why aren't other performers heckled, like opera singers, for instance? You never hear about an opera singer being heckled, do you? I mean, you never hear about Luciano Pavarotti. I mean, I know he's dead now, but he's about to launch into Nessun Dorma or something like that. Nobody's going to shout, "Heard it, taxi for Mr. Pavarotti." But not that I'd actually want opera singers to be heckled, because it would be a bit, at least, comedians are talking so you can talk back, so an opera singer couldn't really stop in the middle of a song and give an operatic comeback to a heckler. That'd be a bit hard. But orchestra conductors, they are an entirely different fucking matter. I would love to see orchestra conductors being heckled. What's the fucking point of them? I mean, you see musicians in an orchestra, they're looking down at their music sheets, playing their music, and they're not looking at the orchestra conductor. They're probably thinking, is that Egypt with the stick still there? So maybe I'm ignorant, I don't know, but I do not see the point of fucking orchestra conductors. Share of fucking wasters as far as I'm concerned. So let's start heckling orchestra conductors and leave the stand-ups alone. You could say something like, "Put that stick down, you wanker, and give us an old tune on the cello." That would fucking sort them out, And the other thing is modern painters or modern artists, whatever you want to call them now. I'm not an expert, obviously, but some of it is probably very good, but some of it is, pretentious shite. Now, I know that they aren't performers, but they don't have to face the public, do they? Some of these modern painters, particularly, I think some painters should be made squat underneath their paintings in art galleries, particularly if it's some kind of, pretentious shite like a black canvas with just a little white circle painted in the middle called semi-nothingness or some crap like that. So you could go into an art gallery like that, walk into an art gallery, go up to the painting with the black canvas and white circle in the middle with the painter squatting underneath, look at the painting as if you're really summing it up, and then after about 10, 20 seconds, just start moving your head from side to side, look down at the painter squatting underneath this painting and just go, "Shite!" Now, the thing about heckling is, I was very lucky. I was very rarely heckled for some reason. I don't know. It wasn't because I was better than other comedians, but for some reason, even if I was down in my arse, I still was very rarely heckled. And actually, it would have been better when I was down in my arse if somebody had heckled me, because it would have released the tension a bit. But I was very rarely heckled, and I think I don't know why I was. I think I had kind of a hangdog look about me, and also I was a bit older than most of the other comedians. I didn't start comedy until I was 35, I think. And most comedians these days start, 16, 17. I know actually Kevin Bridges, I know this for a fact, because I used to run a show called, compere show called Sunday Service, and it was at the Stand Comedy Club. I've forgotten where. I did it for about 20 years and I've forgotten the name. It was called Michael Redmond's Sunday Service. And I remember Kevin Bridges came down once, and I remember he was only 16, because the reason I remember is that because the Stand Comedy, it was a licensed premises, they sold alcohol, and he wouldn't have been allowed in the venue. Not, even if he wasn't drinking, he still wouldn't have been allowed in the venue if he was under 17. So he used to have to bring his father with him to perform at the Stand Comedy Club. And that's how I know that he started when he was only 16. But I was 35 when I started stand-up comedy, much later than comedians these days. And there was a couple of reasons for that. It was when I left school, it was 1968. Number one, there wasn't any stand-up comedy clubs in Ireland or Britain, I think, at that stage. It hadn't really taken on. There was those those working men's clubs where they told the mother-in-law jokes and so-called blue jokes, that kind of thing. But there was no tradition of what you want to call alternative or modern stand-up comedy at that time. So the thought at that time of becoming a comedian just wouldn't have entered my head. And I think even if I'm being perfectly honest, if there was that sort of culture, then I probably wouldn't have done it, because I couldn't imagine myself at 18 getting up on stage. I don't think I would have had the nerve. And it took me a long time to actually get the nerve to stand up on stage, because my main focus with comedy was writing at the start. But it took me a long while even to get into that, because the school I went to was, I can describe it, it's kind of like the British public school that was very, very middle class, and my parents weren't snobs. It was just the nearest school I went to. But when you graduated from the school, you became either an architect, an accountant, or a solicitor, that kind of thing. And I had absolutely no interest in being an accountant or an architect or a solicitor or anything like that. So I hadn't really a clue what I wanted to do. I think most people at 17 don't really have a faintest idea. A lot of people go to university just to kind of bide a few years till they decide what they want to do. But I had no fucking idea at that time. So I didn't want to go to university either. So I just got a job in some insurance office just for, for pocket money, really. And it was okay for a couple of years because there was quite a few young people like myself, and we had a bit of a laugh. But then, as 4 or 5 years went on, people left and people got married. And I remember when I left, I ended up in this little small insurance office with about 3 or 4 very sensible insurance types, and I just almost really went fucking insane. It was just dreadful. And I just walked. I think I probably did have a nervous breakdown. I just walked out of the office one day and I didn't come back. Now, I say I had a nervous breakdown. It wasn't like what you expect a nervous breakdown. I wasn't running down my high street in my underpants. But I just mentally, I think I did have a bit of a breakdown. And then I just drifted in from job to job, insurance offices, other offices. Then I'd sign on the door for a bit and then drift into another office. And I just didn't have a clue what to do. A lot of people have said to me since then, well, maybe you should have just gone away for a year, traveled around Europe or something, and, something might have come into your head what you wanted to do. But the culture then, certainly where I lived, was that if you did that and you came back, no employer would employ you because you'd just be regarded as a bit of a waster. I know that's not like that now, but that's the way it was then. So for 10 years, I just did this in and out of jobs I fucking hated. And it wasn't just the jobs I hated. It affected my whole social life because at the weekend, I couldn't really enjoy weekends because I'd be thinking, Christ, I have to go into this fucking office at the weekend, or on Monday, sorry. And I have to sort of put up with another week of doing things I fucking hated and I had no interest in. So I really had no idea what I wanted to do. And that lasted about 10 years, maybe even longer, maybe it was 12 years. But my first sort of introduction to comedy was, I had liked comedy. I mean, I loved the Marx Brothers and I loved the Goon Show on Radio 4, and I also loved Monty Python, which we got in Dublin. In fact, Dublin was the only place that got Monty Python because there was some signal, BBC signal over in Wales, and we didn't pay a license, but for some reason the signal transmitted BBC, so parts of Dublin got Monty Python. So I did like comedy, but when I met Dermot Morgan, who later became Father Ted, he was a friend of my brother, one of my brothers, and at the time he'd been sending in these little monologues to a radio show. It was called the Mike Murphy Show, similar to BBC's Terry Wogan Show. It was kind of a playful, sort of, chatty kind of morning show. And he told me he'd be sending in these comedy monologues to this guy called Mike Murphy. And he suggested, because he knew I liked comedy, he suggested I do the same, which I did, and I couldn't believe it. He started reading them out. I mean, he started reading out my monologues. I was floating on air for a few weeks, but then, it was I think I got 15 quid an episode or something, 15 quid a script, and I was only submitting one script a week. So I knew I wasn't going to make a living out of it, and I still hadn't given any thought to being a stand-up comedian. It still hadn't entered my head. So I carried on just doing in and out of shitty jobs and writing these scripts occasionally. But then somebody told me that there was a show, it was during August, there was a show on Radio 4 which showcased stand-up comedians at the Edinburgh Fringe. And I wasn't even aware of the culture that, I wasn't even aware there were stand-up comedy clubs in Britain at this stage. I think they started off in London, with Ben Edgerton and Alexi Sale, all those kind of things. And I listened to this show, and that's when a light went on in my head, and I thought, yeah, I could actually fucking do that, or I think I could do that. I wasn't arrogant about it. But from then on, I didn't just write the stuff for the radio show. I started writing gags that I thought I could actually use as a stand-up. I think probably most of it was crap, but I deliberately sat down and decided that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start writing gags and become a stand-up. There still wasn't any comedy clubs in Ireland, though. So I think it was I can't remember exactly. I mean, it's gone back to 1985, 86. I think it was about a year after that I decided I would go to London. And that was my eureka moment. So I just went there. And it worked out quite well. But part of the reason I'm saying all that is that I'm not looking for sympathy, but I did really suffer for those 10, 12 years, because I really thought, if somebody had said to me at the start, this is your sentence, you've got a sentence of 10 years to work in offices, but after that you'll find your niche, it would have been okay. But the problem was, I thought, there is nothing else, this is my life, and it was nearly driving me insane. So if there anybody else, any of you out there who are stuck in jobs, stuck in a rut that you think, Christ, I hate my life, I wish I could find something else, you just got to focus your mind. If you really are determined enough to find something else, you will find your niche eventually. So there's a little bit of advice from Uncle Michael. Don't give up. Keep trying. You'll find something. In last week's episode, I mentioned a joke from one of my favourite comedians, a guy called Seymour Mace, a Geordie guy, one of my favourite comedians. And I mentioned the joke by chance because I was talking about something else. It was to do with Chubby Checker, but Uma Thurman's name came up, and Seymour has an absolutely brilliant joke about Uma Thurman. So if you want to hear it, go back to the last episode, episode 9, and you'd hear it. It was a top class joke, but I hadn't intended putting it in the episode. But since then, I've been thinking, I have done stand up for 35 years, so why don't I include some of my favorite comedians' jokes in each episode? So this week I'm going to talk about, I'm going to tell you a joke about from one of my favorite comedians, a guy called Nick Revel, who some of you may be aware of, some of you not. He's actually did my Sunday service in Glasgow a few times. He's one of my favorite comedians, but he's also a really nice guy, Nick, and I've known him for, 35 years. And we did a few gigs all over England together over the years. You might also know him, actually. Nick, he was one of the main writers on Drop the Dead Donkey, which was a really popular satirical show, and I think he still does a lot of writing for Radio 4. He's a very clever man. But he's not just a good comedian, he's a really nice guy. I'll tell you why, because he compared the first gig I did at the Comedy Store. I was in London for about a year at the time, and I was doing my first open spot at the Comedy Store, which was pretty terrifying, because that was the kind of the RSC of comedy. You had to, it was the place to be if you wanted to get noticed. And I remember Nick was comparing the Comedy Store the night I was doing my open spot, and I was actually terrified. I mean, my heart was palpitating before I went on. But some compers, they just make the laughs for themselves and kind of don't really care about. They just sort of get a big laugh and say, "Oh, okay, here's the next act," or whatever. But Nick wasn't like that, and a lot of compers aren't like that. A lot of compers are, nice guys as well, and will give you a bit of a build-up. But Nick gave me a really nice build-up, even though he didn't even know me. I don't think he'd even seen my act, but he gave me a really, really nice build-up, which kind of helped me a lot because he settled the audience before I came on, and I did a really good gig. And I can put that down to Nick Revel, and we've been sort of friends ever since. And hopefully we get him on the show sometime soon. He lives in London, so, but I'm sure he'll be up in Glasgow at some point, and we get him on for a chat. But I want to tell one of his jokes, and it's one of my favourite jokes. He was doing a routine about how rock stars die really early. The sort of rock, not like, they're quite sensible now, rock stars, I think, but in the old days they used to be, lots of drinking, drugs, and a lot of them died quite early. People like, Jimi Hendrix, the guitarist, Kurt Cobain, although he didn't actually die from drinking drugs, he died from shooting himself, but probably brought on by drinking drugs, who knows. As Keith Moon of The Who, and whoever that lead singer of The Doors was, I can't remember his name. It doesn't matter anyway. What was his name? Jim Morrison, my producer just told me it was Jim Morrison. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. He was doing this routine about all these rock stars dying early from the wild rock and roll lifestyle. And then he started talking about Keith Richards. And he said the thing about Keith Richards is that he is actually dead, but he's just too stoned to notice. And that's one of my favourite gags of all time. And it's all down to Nick Revel. Now, I've already mentioned about the competition I put out for you to guess the number of times Ali McCoist would say, "I got a C," during his commentary of the entire Euros. But what I forgot to mention is, because I'm a bit of an old idiot, I forgot to mention that there is a prize for the winner, and the prize is a free signed copy of my book, which is called Eamon, Older Brother of Jesus. It's still available on Amazon, so if you don't win the competition, go out and buy it. It's basically, it comes from a Radio 4 show I did of the same name, which was later banned by Radio 4, but I'll be talking about that in another episode. So I adapted the Radio 4 show to a book, and it's called Eamon, Older Brother of Jesus. It basically chronicles the life of Jesus' older brother, Eamon, who was brought up in a household with his younger brother as the Messiah. And it sort of talks about his attempts to maybe emulate or upstage Jesus, and usually all failed horribly. But there's lots of different stories in it. There's one particular, I'll just give you a brief glimpse of one of the stories, is that Eamon tries to become an alternative Messiah. And instead of recruiting fishermen, he recruits fishmongers, that kind of thing. And he also tries to open up a restaurant called the Seafood Shack, but he makes the mistake of opening it at the same time as Jesus walks on water in the Sea of Galilee or whatever it was, so nobody takes notice of his restaurant, all that kind of thing. So that's all in the book. But I'm giving out a free copy to whoever wins the Ali McCoist competition. Now, this episode, or it's not this episode, the podcast, as you know, is called What Are You Doing in My Garden? Now, some of you may know why it's called What Are You Doing in My Garden? Some of you may not. So I'll just give you a little bit of a background and I'll explain why. I used to do a gag when I was on the London comedy circuit in the late 80s, early 90s. And in those days, I used to stand on stage. I was wearing a Mac. That was kind of part of my persona. I was a very sort of strange persona. I would do these one-liners and then pause. But then at some stage during the evening, I would just stare at the audience in my Mac and say, people often say to me, "Hey, you, what are you doing in my garden?" And actually, I did mention earlier that I was never heckled, very rarely heckled, but I was heckled once when I was doing that gag by a woman actually a woman. It's usually a man who heckles, but this time it was a woman. And it was kind of supportive, but it wasn't. But it was because I was standing there with my Mac. She said, "Show us your willy." And now, luckily, I wasn't struck because when you're on stage, your adrenaline is pumping. So I managed to immediately come back and say, "I'd love to, darling, but I'm afraid you might try to eat it." So that even sort of made the gig even better. um, the whole reason I mentioned that is that the gag, "What are you doing in my garden?" was notoriously stolen by another comedian called Joe Pasquale, kind of a mainstream comedian. And he actually performed it on the Royal Variety Command performance. And Stuart Lee does a brilliant routine about it. You should listen to it. He really takes the mickey out of Joe Pasquale for ripping off my gag. But his was a bit different because I'd already done that on television. I'd done it on the Clive Anderson Talks Back show. And it had already been on television, so everybody knew it was my gag. So he did it again, so he just looked like a fucking idiot. Nowadays, it's a bit different because you get comedians on television, whether they're ripping off club comedians or whether they've got writers do it, but then they do it on television and it becomes their gag, which is a bit shit. But in my case, it didn't matter because I'd already done it on television and everybody knew it was my gag. Okay. So on my particular subject, we're going to be heading over to the Edinburgh Fringe in August. Some of you may not know that, but the Edinburgh Fringe or the Edinburgh Festival is the biggest arts festival in the world. There's performers, all kinds of performers from all over the world. You've got street performers, jugglers, plays, ballets, everything. But we'll obviously be focusing mainly on comedy because it is a comedy podcast. And we'll be chatting to different comedians who are doing the Fringe, sort of talking about their Fringe venue, their experiences at the Fringe and what it's like performing at the Fringe, all that kind of thing. And also we will be talking about joke stealing, but that won't be the main focus. And talk about how they started in comedy, why they started in comedy, and what their show is about, all that kind of thing. And it could be in their venue, it could be, just meet some old friends in a bar and have a chat. It'll just be a bit of fun, a bit of relaxed fun. So do look out for that. That's coming in August, and I'll give you a bit more information when we get closer to the time. So that is about it for this week. Thanks again for listening. All of you, if anything you want to say, you can contact us on Twitter at Waydim. That's WAYDIMG, or on our email, which is whatayoudoinginmygarden@gmail.com. So see you next week, hopefully. That's all from me. Thank you again. Bye-bye.